Thank you for having me. Thank you, Laurel, for inviting me. It's really nice to be here with all of you this evening. So I'm here in Quaysam in Roberts Creek, and just down the road from Allison. So nice to see a couple faces that I know. So I'm going to share my screen here and take us through a few slides. Okay, so as I was preparing for today, I was remembering a couple weeks ago I was at a conference, and it was an applied research conference called Research for Systemic Design. So people come together from all sorts of different disciplines and practices and histories, and I'll share a little bit later the reason why I was there. I was sort of there to tell some stories from some of the climate justice work that I'm doing right now. And I was sitting beside someone who was like, climate and justice, I don't understand how those two things go together. And I was partly offended because it was delivered in a slightly disparaging tone, I'm not going to lie. But also my curiosity was piqued. I was like, how is that something that is not like, for me, because I've been in it so long, it's quite obvious what those connections are. But for him, he was like, justice is a distinctly human experience. And how does climate relate to justice? And so I've tried to remember the gift of that question in preparing for today, and trying not to take for granted that everybody kind of thinks about the intersections of these concepts every day. So I'm going to tell some stories of my experiences working in this in Vancouver, weave a little bit in from some things that are and maybe are not happening here on the coast, and then share a few images from some work that I'm doing right now. So a little bit first about the climate part of climate justice. So there's lots actually in the news right now because there's a conference of the parties. The big international UN climate conference is coming up here soon. And so maybe you've noticed you're starting to see more stories about things that are happening in the news locally, nationally, internationally about climate. There is and last year all of the scientists and social scientists, or not all, many hundreds of scientists and social scientists who work in the space internationally started publishing these working group reports, and so that lead into these big international meetings. And so this latest climate change report from last year, these series of working group reports, reaffirmed that the science is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and to the health of the planet. And so probably some of you have been paying attention to this over many years, many decades even, that this is clear. The evidence is irrefutable. The climate is changing, and the only challenge now is how we're going to get to work on it together. And for me, it's as much about a climate question as it is a justice question, because we're seeing the impacts are not equally impacting people. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change, and some people are impacted more than others, both locally in our own community as well as internationally and in different parts of the world. So there's real, and this latest report from the International Panel on Climate Change is starting to affirm those entanglements of climate injustice, climate and colonization, the unequal benefits and burdens of our history and present of climate action and inaction. And so we're starting to see the international scientific and political consensus is also agreeing that climate and justice are entangled issues with similar root causes. So this, for me, like as you shared in my bio, I'm a real nerd in the public sector innovation space. And this is Jerry DeMarco, who is the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development for Canada. And he is in the Office of the Auditor General. So he's an auditor. Like his work is to audit the government's performance. So we're used to auditing as a financial measure. But this guy, Jerry DeMarco, is a real courageous civil servant hero, in my view, in a nice suit and tie with a bunch of fish on it. And he said he's audited the federal government's performance on our own climate commitments and what we've said that our federal government has said that we're going to do. And he just released the latest audit on some of the climate plans and policies and targets that our federal government has made, and said this, this is like targets and plans have come and gone, and Canada has yet to really address this. And he says, this is not my first time sounding the alarm, and I'm going to continue to do so until Canada turns the tide. You can actually watch his hour-long press conference on CPAC if you're into the political news. I really recommend it because he just says over and over and over again, the challenge is not that we don't know what to do, that we don't agree that there's a problem. The challenge is not that other countries, like we're the only country in the G7 that has not reduced our emissions based on the baseline that we've all agreed to measure against. And so we're really lagging here. And I think that it's important for us to know that, because unless you listen to folks like Jerry, you might not know that the commitments aren't really being followed through. And so I think that that's really important for all of us to know. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more into cities here, because that's where my practice really is in the space of cities and communities. And you might remember this was in the before pandemic before times. So it's maybe there are many urgent things that have happened since then, but about 4 or 5 years ago, jurisdictions around the world started declaring a climate emergency. So it was a different sort of tone and tenure to the message that we're not just making climate plans and setting targets anymore, but we're declaring that we're in a climate emergency. Our local governments here didn't quite do that. And so the town of Gibson's has committed to some other international work, but like this real clear, this is a climate emergency. We know what happens when we declare an emergency. We respond differently, right? Like this is an emergency situation. We're going to respond like it's an acute emergency situation. We're going to head to the emergency room. We're going to get all the talent on this problem, and we're going to work on it like with the urgency required. And so this was really what this was about, this declaration. And so Vancouver was one of the cities that declared a climate emergency. And this is already, there's a history going back to the 1990s, maybe even before, but depending on exactly how you measure it, where Vancouver's been working on climate action for a long time. It's a jurisdiction has been recognized around the world, even though it's a relatively small city, for leading in sustainability work and climate work for a long time. We could debate that if you like, but there's awards and things that have been given to Vancouver for their leadership in this space. And it's because of these long-term plans and then the implementation of these plans. It takes a really long time to change. There's the politics of it, but then there's the civil service work. And it takes a really long time to change these massive infrastructures of policies and plans and historic land use decisions that result in the kinds of building and transportation patterns that we see around us today. And so Vancouver's climate policy kind of includes 3 main areas of work and sort of a fourth that's on the edge of it. So the first is the Climate Emergency Action Plan, and that's about mitigation. So mitigation is like reducing emissions. How do we try and reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases right now through things that we're doing? The other part is the climate adaptation strategy. So that's how do we adapt to the already changing climate. So you can see they're very different, different frames through which to think about policy and planning work, and very different implications of mitigation and adaptation. And then on the thing that I mentioned on the edge, there's a fairly recent just economic transitions plan that was made by the Economic Development Agency of Vancouver that's related, but a little bit arm's length to the city. And then the work that I was recently a part of is this climate justice charter that's really focused on equity as the foundation of both. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's in there in a moment. So mitigation in Vancouver in the level of a city is really about natural gas in buildings and fossil fuels in transportation. The jurisdiction of things that a city can do some things about are mostly here for our city. Not every city is the same, but most of the mitigation actions that Vancouver is focused on relate to the energy used in buildings and the energy used to get around. Main adaptation actions are things like, as you can see, I mean, these are images from Vancouver, but we could quite as easily put images from our own community here. We have all experienced decreases in air quality due to wildfire smoke. We've had flooding events here, and That's a picture of the seawall on the bottom left from some high tides mixed with increasing storm events, the increasing impacts of storm events. And then in the summers, which is very unusual here, we're starting to see extreme heat, right? And so that changes a lot for us in terms of how we keep our communities safe in changing contexts. So the climate adaptation plan is addressing policies and strategies around how do we respond to these sorts of things. And so before I move into the climate justice charter, I think there's an important message to go back to what Jerry DeMarco says, that despite all the work that Vancouver has done and that, you know, other cities and other levels of government around the world have done, we're falling short in Vancouver and in many other places, and definitely in Canada as well. While the window for action, meaning the time we have to act in the emergency response sort of a way that's needed, is rapidly closing. So just to make things even more challenging, is that a lot of the work on climate up till now has not, in this part of the world anyway, has not really has not really integrated equity or reconciliation or justice or decolonization or even health and wellness, the social determinants of health measures. And they have really deeply interconnected root causes. You know, the root causes of the climate crisis are similar to the root causes of inequities, growing inaffordability and reconciliation challenges in our communities. And so this work to make a climate justice charter for Vancouver was really about trying to bring those two worlds more closely together and make sure that climate action in adaptation and in mitigation and also in economic development work is also just work. And so that's what we were really tasked to do. So this process was really interesting and really unusual for a city, because what we did is we handed the pen over to write this climate justice charter to leaders in community. These are the climate and equity working group that informed this work at the City of Vancouver. Usually when we do policy work, we as staff, I'm not staff anymore, but I still say we because it wasn't that long ago that I was working on this. We usually do consultation, right? We have an idea about what it is, staff, you know, civil servants have an idea about what it is that we're going to do. We do some drafting, we do some research, we write, you know, potential directions, and then we engage with community to ask what they think about what it is that we're doing. In this case, we really inverted the power dynamics. So we handed over the responsibility for writing the charter to this group of folks from community with the support from some really talented consultants. And so it was an unusual and really interesting process, I think, because it moved part of doing climate justice work is shifting where power for decision making lies, who's listened to, who has a role in shaping the decisions that are made, and really changing that up from the dominant systems that tend to do that. So you can see here the working group said that this charter provides direction and describes possibilities where climate related injustices are not repeated, where healing is prioritized over harm, and where new benefits and opportunities from climate actions are equitably shared. So this is a real, in the charter, and I'll share the link afterwards, you can see there's principles and values in there that are really different than the way that the city usually talks about climate work. And so it's quite interesting to see how, when community is responsible for writing something like this, how different it is from when staff are writing something that needs to be approved by a city council. So one of the things that this group did that was really important was that they took this massive idea of justice and climate and pulled it into some related threads. So these are rhizomes, these are kind of root systems, rhizal root systems, to show that they're connected. But each of these justices are different. They're related, but they're different, and they have a different focus. They have different people, or more than humans in multi-species justice sense, who have different experiences of justice and injustice. It's not all one big idea. It's nuanced. And so what they did for us is they helped us to pull these apart so that we could be more skillful in, both as a city, but as a community as well, in responding to these different justices in appropriate ways. So that was really led us to, as we were thinking about how to implement this charter and thinking about how to continue sharing power, as this is again the we here as city staff, we realized we needed to experiment with some different processes and some different ways of working. And so we pulled together something we call the Climate Justice Field School to continue the work of implementation of the charter. And this is a collaboration between Carr University and the City of Vancouver, and many community partners are also involved with it as well. And the field school is intentional. So we're out in community, we're in different places, we're sitting in circle, we're learning from the land, and we're really trying to think about how do we relate better with one another and share power as we move into implementation of the charter. We have these moorings, and I'll share a blog post that my colleague Lily wrote about these, but we were trying to figure out, like, when you're sharing power and things are sort of messy and open and ambiguous, how do you still stay kind of grounded and landed in something, some sort of shared understanding and purpose of what it is that you're doing? And so we use this analogy or this metaphor of moorings to help us to stay grounded and stay connected with the work and with each other while we explored what sharing power and implementing the charter meant. And I'll just close here with a couple of things that we're learning in this process. Our last session together is actually later this week. And from there, we'll figure out where that work, the field school work, might go. But some of the things we're learning in this space of implementing something like a climate justice charter, the important role of witnessing, thank you, Janice, I see that. I'll just finish this slide if that's okay. Okay, thank you. The important role of witnessing in this work. Witnessing is a tradition from Squamish Nation and other Indigenous peoples in the Coast Salish territories. Really practicing methods for intercultural dialogue and exchange. That there's a real need for truth-telling and decolonizing work without necessarily needing to move into action afterwards, but really staying with the truth part of the truth and reconciliation work that we're doing in lots of different contexts. One really important thing in this field school space is about stepping outside a human-centric, current generation worldview in recognition of this entangled multi-species justice, multi-species kin for present and for future generations. There's real intersectional challenges of climate change. Intersectional meaning like people have all kinds of different lived identities and experiences of climate justice and injustice. And it's very complex, and we can't just skip over the complexity of that kind of work. And then the last thing I'll say here is that the importance of rest, joy, and love as embodied practices of resistance and healing. That climate justice work isn't just running, or even though it's a climate emergency, it's not just running all the time. There's a thinker and thinker that I really like, whose name is Bayo Akomolafe, and he says the times are urgent. We must slow down, and I think that that's a really really good message to end on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. That was very informative. I can tell you that I done a little bit of snooping on you for this, and you have some very impressive actions that you've taken throughout your life, from just from the schooling, but also from initiatives that you've started. I read that you were also in the community that got the first Canadian building approved for LEEDs. And so, we really see that you're really passionate and committed to the environment and to climate. And I was wondering, how did this bubble up? I mean, it seems so future oriented and big. When did you get involved? How did this passion, kind of start within you?
Thank you for stooping on me, and thank you for that question, Natalie. I honestly don't know. I've asked my mom about this a few times because I'm definitely the black sheep in my family. It's not from my family. It's not the kind of ethic of the family or really the experience that I had growing up. So, but my mom tells me that I always kind of had this inclination, and so I don't really know where it's come from. I've definitely had many different layers of my own learning in the space though, moving more, my work when I was in my 20s was really different than it is now. And so I feel really grateful to be in a community of some really amazing people and teachers and colleagues and friends that I've done this work with and learned a lot from them over the years.
Another little bit of snooping. There was a quote from Dwayne Elverum, and it says, Lindsay knows where this planet needs to go. Can you share with us a bit of why Dwayne there believes that you know where this planet should go? Where is that? Where should we be going from your point of view?
Oh, that's a tough, I mean, Dwayne is an exuberant person, so maybe I'll just exuberant and generous. I would never describe myself that way. I feel like for me at this moment in time, there are so many ways to just move toward where we collectively want and need to be going to make sure that to be good ancestors. Maybe I'll use that frame, to be good ancestors. And we all have, there's an abundance of ways to do that. So find the way that makes sense for you, that's like your unique gift and the contribution that you can make, whether it feels, I feel like too, as I've, now that I'm in my more middle age, like it's a collection of many small actions. That's actually what we need, because I don't think change doesn't happen when we wait for the sort of big charismatic megafauna leader to do that, or for the political leaders to do that. Like they're all, especially in doing public innovation in the public sector for this long, all of these big institutions that we have follow the lead of us, right? As people who care about the places where we live and care about the communities where we're in. And so maybe that's how I'd answer that right now.
With and you were really, the institutions, big and longer sort of make change and move through transition. As you were talking about us in the small steps, what are some different things that you can think we today can do, or to help support, sort of this bigger issue of climate change and climate?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to, I don't know if you all do this, but I'd love to open that up to hear about that from everybody who's here, because I'm sure you're all thinking about that in your own ways. Maybe I'll speak personally. For me, a lot of the work that, especially as I've moved more from environment focused work to more and sustainability work to more of having a justice lens to what it is that I'm doing, that's been a lot of learning and reflection on my own part to try and understand what that means to be in right relationship with people and with place, and not just be kind of perpetuating colonial ways of working, that are the dominant ways of working and not dominant ways of being. So I feel like for me, that's a part, I think that's work for all of us to do, is really that reflective work and moving from a place of really understanding and knowing yourself and whatever the privileges are that you hold in the world, and knowing that you're not perpetuating that when you're out and trying to do good work in community. And then from there, there's all kinds of things that can be done. I'm not a proponent. I have a teenager who, and there's still a lot of messaging that comes at change your light bulbs and, turn down your thermometer in your house. And sure, those things are important, but I feel like a lot of those real personal climate actions, greenhouse gas reduction actions, are actually if you listen to Jerry DeMarco's talk, it's 80 or 90% of the emissions in Canada are still coming from the fossil fuel industry, right? From the from that sector, it's not about what you're doing in your, what heating source. So that stuff matters, but like, don't only do that, right? Like do some other things that are activating shifts at these bigger systemic, structural, infrastructural levels, because that's really what needs to change now. And understanding where the power to make those changes lies, and trying to influence those systems of power in whatever ways you have access to do that, I think are really important right now.
Could you be a bit more specific for me? Because I do hear, and have heard for years sort of that general change your light bulbsy kind of concept. But I feel for me personally, and I don't know, I can open this up to when we get to everybody else, is that, okay, where is that next part? Like, what am I missing between my light bulb and, more systemic change within, the world, our community, our Canada, our country, as we go out. But I'm kind of missing, like the next run up of what do I do on a bigger, or who do I go to, or like, where do I go? Who do I contact? Where do I put my hand up to say, hey, I'd like to see more done in this arena?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some, so locally, there's the regional district is making a new climate plan. And so they've started sharing like they're in the planning stage. And so there's public consultation that's happening. There's work that's being done there, and they need more of us to care about it. Like, there's a lot of issues that we have on the coast, and I think climate isn't always at the top of the list for people, but it is like related to many of the other things that are happening on the coast, but we don't necessarily see it in that way. And so track what's happening with town, like Seashell has a sustainability plan from, I think it's maybe 5 years old now, and hasn't really said anything lately that I've been able to see about real clear increasing attention to climate action. And like the town of Seashell is really vulnerable to climate change. We all are, right? Like, we live in a coastal community that's really vulnerable to a changing climate. And so maybe that's the answer, is do what makes sense to you, to get more involved in increasing the attention and focus and investment of time and resources and energy into climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and try and get our community making some of the bigger moves that are needed, because I think we've done some small things, but we need to make some bigger moves here.
With that, from that question, so I wanted then to open up to our Toastmasters and guests this evening. And for you to be able to, reach out to Lindsay and ask her what are the things that are on your mind? What things do you maybe want clarity on, or for her to expand on? And if there's, you can offer Lindsay, or to share with the group of us that you know of, then please feel free to chime in that as well. And Tom, open up the floor. Lindsay, this is.
I have a question. I at least noticed, or at least from my own perception, it appeared as though the pandemic had an impact on climate change. I'm just curious if there was a measurable impact from the pandemic. And further to that, would a more working from home general work life structure have the desired impact?
Thanks for that question, Tom. I'm not, I would encourage you to look up the data people's story there. My understanding, which is at a higher level, is that in the early days of the pandemic, when all the planes were on the ground, no one was going anywhere, there was a reduction, but it wasn't that much, because actually, like, as I said, only some of it is related to our individual behavior, right? Like, that's actually a pretty small part of the puzzle. The oil sands kept producing oil all over the world. the natural gas kept getting pulled out of the ground all over the world. And so there was a small reduction in travel, but it's not lasted because consumption of goods and services, goods went up, right? We were all buying stuff from home in our living rooms. And that, like, there's many, it's a complex and integrated part of our economic system. And so it was, I think there was a little dip, but then it continued along.
Thank you very much, Tom. Aaron.
Hi there. Thank you, Lindsay, for your visiting and being our speaker tonight. A few years ago, I watched a documentary called Frightened. Have you ever heard of it? Anyway, I think I saw it on Canopy on the library app. It might have been borrowed from the library. But the message that I seem to remember from this time is the freighters. It's called Frightened instead of Frightened. But the pollution from those freighters are more than all the cars combined in the world, apparently. Have you heard anything like this before?
Yeah, it's the whole world of goods movement. And so that at that level, all the way to the delivery vehicles that are like running things around in the city and everything in between is a huge emitter of carbon. And there's actually lots of really interesting work, if this is your jam, there's lots of really interesting work about electrifying those kinds of fleets. So there's a lot, there's people trying to figure out how to turn that into use cleaner fuel sources for goods movement at different scales. So it's an interesting story. And one of the things that maybe I'll raise that's related to that is when you do the international, the very detailed climate math, like what emissions are being emitted from where and from what sources, it's attributed to countries, and countries set targets based on the emissions that are attributed to them. But there are some things that are global, like air travel, that aren't really accounted for in the math because they don't live only in Canada or only in, Zimbabwe. They're more international. And so I think it's important when you're reading those kinds of reports and statistics and targets that there are things that fall out of these jurisdictions that aren't being measured by anyone. And some of the international travel connects to that too.
And just this other topic of bunker fuel that gets dumped in the ocean, it's really dirty fuel, apparently. I think that's another big issue.
Yeah, I mean, climate work and justice work are entangled with biodiversity loss and with pollution of the air and of the water, and right, like it's with real long-term impacts on landscapes where fossil fuel extraction activities are happening, with harms caused to the people, often indigenous communities that live in the places where those activities are happening, right? Like there was the ferry. Was it a ferry or a different ship that went aground just up the coast?
Are you talking about the Queen of the North?
In Heltzig territory, and just destroyed their food sources along their coastline, right? And so these things are really related, right? You can't pull climate, especially you can't pull climate out of these other global systems. And that's when I say like they have the similar root causes to other issues. That's what I mean, right? Like these choices that we make around extraction of resources from the land at sort of all costs, and the ways that we think about how the economy currently works, and we don't think that there are actually other ways to be that we've had before about how to organize ourselves as humans in society that cause less harm. So yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective and way to think about how these things are related and connected.
Thank you.
Maybe something that Tom said too. So Tom, just to pick up on the work from home bit. So only like I'm a person who is privileged enough to be able to work from home, right? I have an office, a desk, or a computer-based job. But that's a justice thing. Like there's lots of people in the world that their jobs don't look like that. Their jobs are, running the grocery stores and running the hospitals and delivering things to people, and so that there's many people who don't have the privilege to work at home. So that's where kind of the climate benefits of commuting and being able to stay from home also have a real justice lens to be put on that.
Thank you. And Johanna.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was really informative. And I'm just wondering, are you seeing more women taking leadership in this grassroots field of justice?
Yeah, I mean, so the folks that were on the climate and equity working group and that are in the field school, they're younger than me. They're they're not just women. There's lots of non-binary folks that are in that space. There's lots of people of color who are leading in the space, and so it is a much more diverse leadership in all ways, I would say. They don't necessarily, that's not represented yet, I would say, in some of these more formal, like when you look at our elected leadership, it's not always represented in places like that yet. So, but where I go to, like where I'm learning a lot and where I'm inspired and the leadership is coming is very diverse. Yeah.
Thank you.
As well.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Lindsay. I've been so impressed that you've worked within the City of Vancouver in an institution, and I know you're a civil servant and it worked with politicians as well. Is it necessary for us? How necessary is it for us, at the grassroots level, to have trust in politicians, or we have to have a relationship with people in power in order to affect change? And what does that relationship look like or feel like? What could that relationship feel like?
Oh yeah. Well, maybe again, I'll share my orientation. So my orientation is I try and start from a place of curiosity and from listening and building relationships. We all have different experiences, different points of view, and those all, that exists in the world, right? We need to contend with those things. So I try and start from that place. I think for me, one of the big lessons learned in working in the public sector for that long is that there are lots of places where power lives that aren't only at the top of the heap. There are decision makers throughout the systems, throughout the bureaucracies, who are responsible for really key decisions and for advising the elected leaders based on their expertise. So power doesn't only lie in the people that are elected. That's only one part of a bigger power map. And so, I try engage in all of the places, right? Like, don't put all your eggs in one basket, and also follow for me, like not everybody has the opportunity and also stomach to kind of engage with power in that particular way. And so if you're the kind of that person, then there's other places where power lives too, that's in community, that's in kind of more civil society organizations, that's in business, right? Like there's all kinds of ways to be in this dance of decision making. And so I like to, figure out who is listening to who and how are decisions being made, and what's, where the informal systems and relationships of power, and figure out like what's actually going on there. Because there's always a lot more than just like what's happening at a public council meeting, for example. There's a lot more going on than what you witness there.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I think if I can, Janice, do we have more time? Alison would like to ask a question as well. Yes, go ahead, Alison.
Well, I would just like to say thank you very much, Lindsay. It was very informative and much more encompassing than I expected. When I heard the words climate justice, I was thinking it would be more for justice for people who are actually right now feeling the effects of climate change, people that were having to move out of their homes because they couldn't have water because of the heat. And I thought it was much more, I didn't think it was quite so connected as you were saying for our community. But I think that today, actually, I was reading Thinking Like a Mountain by Joanne Macy, that was written in '88, and we were in exactly the same position, but worse then, and nothing seems to have happened. And I'm really feeling that we're past the point of changing things. And what we have to do now is prepare for the great turn-in, as she talks, when everything changes. And we have to do that as communities and open our doors to immigrants from climate causes, and just generally change our insularity and connect much more with the wider world. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Alison. That work is really important work to be doing, to that adaptation work, right? The preparation for, we already know we've had small experiences of that here in the last few years, where we do have neighbors who've been dramatically impacted by, storm events and things. So that's really important work to do. I don't know if you saw this in the news the other day, but there was a gathering of the Pacific Island states, again in the preparation lead up to the climate meetings happening shortly. And Australia and Tuvalu, a small island state near Australia, have come to an agreement where Tuvalu, which is a low-lying Pacific Island state that's one of the first to be hit by the changed climate, now have an agreement with Australia for migration, essentially, right? More permanent migration for residency, for schooling, for jobs. So we're at that stage where that's happening. Like it's not something that's in the future. It is happening now. So thank you for bringing that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you very much, Lindsay. This has been very informative, very interesting, and it's definitely, at least for me, has piqued my curiosity. And I invite you, if you could, to reach back out to us and send us some links or some more information or something where, if there are things that in our group that we would like to get involved with, that, if you could point us in the right direction, that would probably be very helpful, because, with all the causes out there, it can be overwhelming to sort of figure out where you're best suited to help. So if we could look to your expertise on that, that would be great. And we really, really appreciate you being a part of our evening and sharing with us your knowledge and your passion. So thank you very much, Lindsay.
Thank you for having me.